Hello and welcome everybody to the very first episode of a series that I like to call Region Rundown. This is the World's 2023 League of Legends Championship Primer, where I'll attempt to go through all the regions participating in this year's tournament, starting off with a region very near and dear to my heart, and with a person that's very near and dear to my heart as well, Mr. RMC, the color caster of the official CBLOL English broadcast. He's also an analyst, and this guy's been doing it for years. If there's anybody else out there that knows more about CBLOL than him, I'd be hard-pressed to find that guy. RMC, did I do you justice on the intro? Is that correct? Is there anything else I missed out?
I think that covers most of it. Should be, as you mentioned, this is the first episode of League of Legends, so obviously you have to bring on the best people for feet, because that's the end of the leagues, right? That's how this goes.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. And I'm already expecting more of these kinds of jokes, guys. It's not done yet. And so I want to cover each individual regions, obviously minor regions, major regions, eventually, hopefully, but I really want to get into CBLOL's representative for this year's World, a team that is known throughout Brazil and has recently got some success and notoriety throughout the rest of the world because of their, I would say, foray into Valorant. But in the League of Legends world, it is Loud Gaming, right?
Yeah, Loud Esports, they're an org that this year especially, they've made a lot of headway in all sorts of sports. They're doing the three-peat in more than one way. So they did the three-peat in CBLOL, where they're the first Brazilian team to make the three-peat. And Brazil, CBLOL, is the last region in the world to get the three-peat. Like, every other region said it, except for CBLOL, till this split. Loud themselves have also done the three-peat in doing Valorant, Free Fire, and League of Legends. They've made worlds in all three titles as well this year. So the org is absolutely popping off. The team for League of Legends, it's the same team that went to MSI. So people might be familiar with this team. Again, three-peat, so third time international event. Loud became famous in League of Legends because of Bodgap, Brunsey, but he's not around anymore. He wasn't actually there at MSI. They already swapped out for Korean AD carry Root, but it's pretty much the same team going back in. So high expectations for this team, but they still haven't made it out of play-ins yet.
Now, I want to zoom out a little bit before we really get into the nitty-gritty of Loud, and I want to talk about the CBLOL region as a whole, because I think everybody in the major regions, NA, EU, Korea, LPL, they don't really respect the CBLOL region. They don't really respect any of the minor regions, even if you are like from the LJL or the PCS or Vietnam. I think like CBLOL always kind of gets underestimated. Do you think some of the, I would say, general narratives about CBLOL being one of the weaker minor regions is correct this time around? Have they been leveling up? I noticed in your document, this massive prep doc, that CBLOL had a really big undergoing of how they play the macro game and how they kind of play League of Legends after, I believe, the very famous coach Peter Dunn was on the scene.
Yeah. Peter Dunn certainly helped advance the scene a lot. So the reputation that CBLOL has internationally, part of it's also because of the way CBLOL views itself. Like, CBLOL doesn't take itself too seriously. Agreed. So we call ourselves the best entertainment region in the world. And it's a really fun region. Like, we have crazy moments. I remember at the beginning of the split, one of our players, Zai, he got transferred to a different team. And when he won his game against his former team, he put up a shirt writing, like, "Was I the problem?" like on that shirt underneath. Like, that's the sort of entertainment you can expect, players yelling at each other, getting up in the middle of the game to kind of shout at each other. The teams have to drag them back down because the game's not over and the Nexus is not done and people are respawning. That's Brazil. So it's understandable that internationally, people kind of underestimate them. I'd say maybe 2019, 2020, Brazil's macro was a nightmare. Like, it's individually, the players are skilled, but they don't work together. They've been improving, though, split after split, year after year. And I think MSI 2023 was kind of a statement year for Brazil, where they beat DFM, which is sort of like the emerging minor region at the time. And, to beat them, it makes a statement that, hey, Brazil is not just here for memes anymore. We are contesting minor regions. We are trying to make a mark. But, I mean, for a lot of the major regions, the problem is the minor regions as a whole have been struggling. And the only one that's been competitive historically, I'd say, or at least regularly and consistently, is PCS. VCS had pop-out moments, but it's just like once or twice, right? So
yeah, and for people that are maybe unfamiliar with the CBLOL region, I think a lot of the older fans will remember kind of the Kaboom Alliance thing, right? I mean, dating myself a little bit, that sent C9 into Worlds, but I think a lot of the other fans will remember, the bot gap where the bot laner of the CBLOL region, he flexed his bicep and he had bot gap labeled on it, I believe, right after it was, I think, a solo kill or a 2v2 kill.
They beat Fnatic.
Yeah, they beat Fnatic and they put the bot gap in there. For CBLOL, like you mentioned, they've been struggling, a lot as a minor region. Where do you think, other than maybe the Peter Dunn turning point for CBLOL was, right? Because you mentioned they beat LJL, right? Like you said, an emerging minor region, a region that's had a very dominant kind of DFM one team region, I would say. And they were kind of seen as the gatekeepers of the minor regions other than PCS, although they've, like you said, been able to go toe to toe. They've taken multiple games off Korea. They've been beating Korea and NA and EU and international tournaments since its inception. What do you think was the turning point for CBLOL where it kind of became for the teams, we're not just entertainment, but we are also trying to create these teams that can go mano a mano, that can go toe to toe with some of these, major region teams?
It's hard to pinpoint like in an
exact moment. Yeah.
Even like Peter Dunn, coaching there, I think helped the scene, but it's not as if the scene wasn't trying to improve. We still have a lot of the old coaches who've been in the scene a long time. People like Maestro, Vaughn, Turtle, who was up in NA for a bit with Evil Geniuses, pardon me.
Yeah.
Back for a second there. Dion Ray, who's Payne's coach, is still around, has been around a long, long time. So they've all been trying to improve. I think a lot of it has also just been slowly over time, like as we get more Korean imports, as our coaches go out, like we mentioned, Turtle went up to NA to learn as well under Evil Geniuses. Like as they kind of go and then they come back and they bring that experience with them, the level of the teams has been just improving. And I think also when the international wildcard tournament kind of stopped, and they start facing teams like Korea and China, NA, EU in Worlds, I think that also really motivated Brazil to improve and kind of taught them a lot of macro. Because when you're just playing amongst the minor regions, if everybody's messing around macro-wise, it's hard to improve. But when you run up against like a Korean or Chinese team, and that's not something you get in, say, like their solo queue or something, right? Like how organized their macro is, that's when teams are really pushed to improve. And I think that's one of the things that removing that international wildcard tournament kind of helped with. And that's why I'm a bit hesitant with this format now. I think the new format is great for competitiveness, not having China, Korea in the play-ins.
Participating in play-ins.
Yeah, I'm a little bit worried that it might take away some of that motivation, some of that that education, if you will, that these minor regions were having every time they go to an international event.
You touched upon that, the point of imports, and I feel like CBLOL as a region has been very up and down with imports, right? I feel like a lot of Korean imports come in. I believe you've had like previous Turkish players, EU players. Unsure if you've actually had any NA players move down to the CBLOL region, but I feel like there are a smorgasbord of Korean players that some of them had a lot of notoriety. Some of them were very, very good. I think GBM at one point ended up playing in CBLOL. I could be wrong on that one, but there were a lot of different...
we had Edward coaching and Diamond Prox actually came to play.
Yeah. Okay. So EU players as well. So can you kind of talk to me about the import culture or the import rule for CBLOL? Like, are they viewing these imports as part of their culture? Or are they saying like, okay, yeah, I want to get these players on my team because I want to improve them? Are they very more homogenous in that sense? Or is it more akin to maybe like EU and NA where like, sometimes imports can be viewed as like, why are we importing these players? We have domestic talent, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. How does the CBLOL region view these kinds of imports? Korea, EU, so on and so forth.
So CBLOL has a lot of personality, and that applies to how they view their imports as well. So you get different teams trying different things, right? Like we have Croc on Loud, for example, is known as possibly the most Brazilianized import we've ever had. Like that guy is out there saying in post interviews like, don't cry karaoke, your dad's here. Like can you imagine a Korean player saying that? Like in other regions, like it's rare, right? But CBLOL has that. But we also have other players like this is a good split to talk about it actually. Trick, right? Coming out of military service to Brazil. He could not integrate. He could not get used to it. And he just left after like a couple of weeks. And that kind of screwed Los Grandes over for their season, right? So we get a mix. Sometimes Los Grandes is a great example because of their coach Stardust, who was the former T1 coach. He likes to bring in Korean imports. And from what I've seen with their comms, they don't really try and necessarily integrate the Koreans into Brazilian culture. They're more focused on just trying like, how can we make this team work on the get-go. So they communicate in English and everything. Payne communicates in English as well, even though their Koreans seem to be a little bit more comfortable, but they want to keep some of that Korean ethic, I guess, or just the style that the Koreans are more used to. Whereas Loud, as we mentioned, like Root as well is being integrated. Like they do a lot of their interviews or a lot of their content in Portuguese, and then they'll translate where necessary for Root and Croc. So we run the whole gamut. But I think generally the idea for CBLOL imports is more that, hey, if it works, they stay on. If it doesn't work, CBLOL does not hesitate to kick out imports if they don't think it works, right? It happened with like Decoy from OS, with Diamond Prox, from EU and stuff like that. Like if it didn't work, you're gone.
And it feels like Korean imports specifically are so opposed, or they would be in theory opposed playstyle wise coming to the CBLOL region. So when you see some of these teams, like for example, Loud or Pain, or like you mentioned, Los Grandes, multiple teams across the region, Netshoes Miners way back, right?
Yeah.
These kinds of teams that integrate or try to integrate Korean imports. Is it more the Korean imports, imparting some of their play style and some of their macro onto the Brazilian team? Or would you say it's vice versa, where now these Korean guys or Korean imports are thrown into the fire and they're like, you know what, it's chaos. All right, I'm going to participate in this chaos. I'm going to out mechanic these individuals. What would you say is the more kind of influential part of these two marriages, I guess?
I'd like to say that bring the imports in, bring in, the Korean ethic, the Korean macro. But realistically, it tends to be more the other way around, where they come in and it's a question of, can you adapt to the chaos? Now, I hate to rag on Trick so much, but for example, I look at Trick, right? He came in and Brazilian League of Legends, especially like early game jungling, stuff like that, can get kind of messy. And I think Trick struggled with that a lot and couldn't quite adapt. Like he tried to bring the Korean way and it kind of didn't work. So I think a lot of times with the imports, they have to get used to it. Like Croc flourished immensely under the chaos because he's an aggressive jungler who enjoys flexing his micro skill a lot. And that's also why sometimes, especially in the beginning of season, when Robo isn't fully online, you'll see Croc do an invade and die. And everybody like, what is this kid doing? Like what? But if the Brazilians are online, like it actually makes sense, right? When Robo's there to back him up. So I think more often than not, they kind of get tainted by CBLOL. But I like to believe through sheer quantity, we slowly do learn bits of things that imports bring in. I look at B-Boy and Pro Delta. Pro Delta was a rookie who started playing this split, and B-Boy did spend a lot of time teaching him. And I think a lot of that lane success does come from Pro Delta getting used to how B-Boy wants to play, intelligently knowing when to go in on the 2v2s and when to punish versus when to roam.
Is there any rhyme or reason on how they import, right? Do they go for like top jungle? Do they go top mid? I know we've seen like solo lane imports before. Do they import full bot lanes at times, right? Like or are they just looking to fill out positions? Like, is it Loud? It's like, all right, well, we have Robo here. We've got Tinowns in the mid lane. What do we need to fill the gaps in? All right, we need a superstar jungler. Let's get Croc in, right? Is that how that works? Or do different teams employ different strategies? Like, do they have a reasoning as to how they import, and are they trying to look for role parity, role matching, that kind of stuff?
Well, I can't speak for all the teams. I do think each team does it differently, but in general, what we've seen historically for CBLOL is that top lane is the region they import the most, and the other position they actually import quite a lot for is support, which kind of throws me off because my original working theory was that you import top laners because they're on an island. Communication is not as important. You just need to know like how to call for a teleport. That's about it. And then you just leave them on an island to dominate 1v1. But the support role requires a lot of communications, and CBLOL does like their Korean supports. So my working theory, and again, depends on the team and how they want to play, but I think top lane's common because, as we mentioned, communication is not as important. It's easy to plug and play. And the support's there for macro reasons, so that you have a support who can help with that sort of macro at the international level, which is, I think, what CBLOL has traditionally been lacking. The role which struggles most with imports, in my opinion, is jungle. Like, yes, there's Croc, but Croc is the exception, not the norm. Most Korean junglers, when they come to CBLOL, struggle a lot with trying to get used to how their lanes want to interact and how they want to prioritize things. I think Croc, one of the reasons why he did so well as a jungler was also because he was able to kind of adapt to the CBLOL style, the chaos, more than actually like the structured style that we're used to seeing from Korean junglers.
Before we, like you said, get into Loud and everything, for the CBLOL split as a whole, can you kind of take me through not just the journey of Loud, but also kind of the other teams competing, right? Let's say I ask RMC, hey, I I didn't have time to watch CBLOL this split. Can you give me a 5 or 10 minute breakdown of some of the teams that were in the mix, some of the big signings that happened maybe, and kind of what shaped out during the regular season and kind of how we got to Loud winning the split? Can you kind of give me that, like what happened at the beginning of the season? Because I understand that Loud had a rough start and they actually ended up as the 3rd seed, correct? After the regular season, they weren't necessarily projected to win the whole thing, right? There were other favorites, but then I think, like you mentioned, the Loud saying, the beast is here, the monster is back, things like that. Can you kind of take me through CBLOL, the boilerplate, kind of what happened during the split, and what are some of the exciting storylines, some of the stuff that you thought was going to happen, but then actually didn't, so on and so forth?
Sure. Yeah, we'll start with that. So quick background on CBLOL. CBLOL generally actually has a lot of parity internally and domestically. So the teams are often very, very competitive. This split was probably the least competitive split we've seen in a hot minute. Like Loud dumpstered almost everyone, and it wasn't even close. So coming to the into the year, I'll start a little bit further back because we had a couple of big sort of big signings, like things that had a lot of people hyped up. We had the super team Fluxu, who had managed to take Brunsey, which was Mr. Botgap himself at the beginning of this year, fresh off that Worlds 2022 run, and they tried to build like a super roster with really good domestic players. Howes was probably the biggest offseason signing between 2022 and 2023. They had a bad split one, so they were coming to split 2 with a chip on their shoulder, trying to show what they could do. We had Furia Kids, or Furia Super Kids, which was a very, very young roster. I think they're the oldest person's like in their early 20s on that roster, so a lot of rookies. IU coming off of the split 1 break actually went over to EU to boot camp as well and took number 1 in the EU West ladder, solo queue ladder. So Furia had a lot of hype with a lot of energy. We had INTZ, who are historical giants in the region. They've got the most championships as an organization, but they flopped last split. So coming to this split, they were looking to show that no, we didn't make mistakes with their signings. They made no changes. They went at it. Kaboom had issues. Their roster got blown up. So their roster this split was kind of like pieced together a little bit. They brought in Flawless, a Korean jungler who, spoiler, remember when I was talking about Korean junglers not always doing well? Yeah, both our Korean junglers or the 2 Korean imports this year ended up leaving partway through the split. Liberty was known as the Libertines last split. They were a bunch of like kind of what Fury was trying to do with rookies and academy players. They ran like a bunch of academy players, young players. They gave up on that idea. They brought in a bit more veteran experience for this split. Los Grandes was Coach Stardust's roster. That was the other super roster. It was the super import roster. We had Hirit in the top lane with Lava in the mid lane last split, and then they gave up on Hirit and tried to bring in Trick. Yeah, that didn't end well. Loud and Pain were the 2 big orgs. Not much changes there. We'll leave them. Red Canids was the super roster. They got Titan, Envy, and FNB. So FNB is like the best Brazilian top laner to never win CBLOL. Yeah. Envy is considered a playoff monster, and they were rescued from their previous roster and brought onto the red roster, which is supposed to be just like power in every single lane. Cade Stars, an old returning org last split. They brought in the Mad Mexican Grell, and they were the worst team last split. They brought in Grell and started winning some games. So they were expected to try and take the league by storm this game. So yeah, took a while to get through all the teams, but that's the background setting. Like a lot of chaos into this split, a lot of potential super teams, a lot of like rookie teams and whatnot. Season starts kind of what we were expecting, like a lot of chaos. Loud was crapping the bed. So I will say this about Loud. Loud will always crap the bed at the beginning of season. Like it's not just MSI hangover, it's not Worlds hangover. Loud just doesn't care about the first half of the split. Like Robo literally has in interviews said regular season doesn't matter, only playoffs matter. So as long as they get top 4 so that they don't start in the lower bracket, doesn't matter. So Loud kind of crapped out. Los Grandes, the Korean import team, was very hit or miss, but Trick couldn't quite get a hang of it. I think after about 3 weeks, Trick actually left Brazil, and that screwed Los Grandes as an organization, not just in CBLOL, but even their academy team. So
was he cut, or did he just like, I don't want to play in this region anymore? Do you know the nitty gritty of the contract? We don't have to really go into it. Was he just like, I'm done? Or did Los Grandes say like, hey, we're going to bench you for, I believe his name is NL1?
Yeah. So NL was from their academy roster. He's played for, I think for Loud in the past. Back before this current era of Loud, like in their first sort of rosters. The official news from Trick was just that he could not adapt to Brazil and wanted to go back. And that's all we officially know about it. So
okay.
Yeah, didn't integrate, but because they actually did that, they actually messed up their academy roster as well because they had to bring up Eno, and then they ended up bringing up Hidan as well to replace Bull, who was struggling. So that roster, which had so much hype around it, just crash and burn for the second straight split. Last split, they came in like first in the regular season. They were so hyped, and then they wiped out in playoffs immediately. So yeah, that was Los Grandes in a nutshell. They were dead. The Liberty experiment, where they tried to bring in more veteran experience with Avenger in the mid lane, that crashed and flamed as well. That completely didn't work. So Liberty just struggled. And by the end of the split, they were just rotating their academy roster up to get some experience. So kind of rough for them. Kaboom, our other Korean jungler, that did not end well either. Flawless, he stayed longer than Trick for sure. They were very hyped. I've seen Flawless in the LJL. I was not hopeful about him from the last time he played. He seemed a bit passive for the CBLOL playstyle, and that happened where he just didn't do anything and was basically invisible most of the game. So yeah, the Kaboom roster absolutely just like couldn't do anything and fell apart. So Liberty and Kaboom absolutely crapped out and one of the worst teams. Cade Stars was exactly what we expected. They were chaos and kind of, that is such a fun team to watch. That is, to me, Red and Cade Stars are like the Brazilian teams.
Wait, so yeah, with Vivo Key specifically, right? I mean, this is a team that I even recognize. Look, with a lot of good players. Damage, Trigo, right? I mean, those are good players in my opinion for the region. I mean, one of my favorite players, Guigo or Guigod, is on there. I was kind of surprised at how far they fell, I guess, in terms of, you know, expectations and stuff like that. What do you think went wrong? Was it just, like you said, bringing in Grell? Was that the issue? Because on paper, Guigo, Trigo, Damage seems like a solid core, no?
Yeah, it is. I mean, with that roster, especially because Gigo is such a dominant top laner, he's one of the best in the region. It works really well when you give him a bot lane that doesn't need resources. And that's the idea behind Trigo and Damage, was that you just leave them alone, permagank top, and you're perfectly fine. The last split, they tried a similar roster, except with it started with Mikau and Bounty in the bot lane instead. And they had Sting as their starting jungler, or Hugado. I forget which one was the starting jungler. They ended up swapping halfway.
Yeah, they think it's swapped.
So yeah, part of the problem was their jungler, Sting and Hugado, weren't good enough to be able to take over. So having Grell was actually a massive upgrade for them. So this roster was supposed to be great on paper. But the things that made them good were also the things that's kind of screwed them, because with the way the meta kind of shifted, there was a lot of bot attention.
Yep.
And Grell didn't want to do that. This roster wanted to play topside. And so they kept doing that. Grell as well, we call him the Mad Mexican for a reason. Like, he makes amazing plays sometimes, but he will also int his face off, which is why I called them like one of the two like most Brazilian teams, despite the fact we've got a Mexican who actually drives this team. It's typical of CBLOL, where the highs are highs, the lows are lows. And so to me, they ended up where I pretty much expected, which was decently well, make playoffs, but kind of middle of the pack, because you're just too unstable. So I think the expectations for this team were a bit too high. They're really fun to watch. I don't know if they're going to stay together though. But yeah, they're a fun team to watch. They did what I expected. Who else do we have here? Fury Kids did really well, actually, in the regular season. I don't know if you heard about their story, but they did not make playoffs. They got down to a time attack where they had to end, I think, 2 games in like 40 minutes or something.
They ran that Ziggs Tristan. They ran like some tower busting composition, correct? Yeah, I believe I was able to tune into that game for a little bit. It was absolutely insane, right? They had to run, and it was, the tiebreaker was due to because they needed to win the games before a specific time, correct? So that's an interesting tiebreaker rule in of itself. I'm pretty sure that's gonna get looked at after this split. Like, they should have just played a tiebreaker game at that point. No, like that would be the
they will not do that.
Step.
This happened 2 years ago, 2021 split 2, I think, or 2022 split 1. It was the one playoffs that Robo has missed in his career. And that was on Loud. Loud also failed a time attack and ended up as 7th seed. So it's happened before. This is not the first time, which is one of the reasons why CBLOL is really fun to watch, because they're willing to do things like this, where they're just going to brute force this. And Fury Kids, they're so fun. They had to time attack and they ended up losing. Yeah, they had that Ziggs, Caitlyn, Heimerdinger composition that they tried to run and it backfired. But that was a super fun team to watch. Yeah, and then Fluxu, the super team, did what they did again last split, where they did won the regular season and they just choked in the playoffs, like right away, got eliminated right off the bat. And that leaves us with our top 4 teams, which was INTZ, Loud, Pain, Red. So I mentioned before, CBLOL is a lot of parity, and that's why I kind of just ran through those bottom side of things.
Yeah.
And then the top side's usually where we have a bit more parity. Like, there's usually 3-4 teams that are contesting. So we had Loud, and I'll leave Loud for last because they're champions, and we'll get into that later. But we'll start with INTZ, who are known as the Giants, the Sleeping Giants. They have the most championships. This was a roster that didn't even make playoffs last split. They haven't made playoffs in a hot minute. Quite a few splits now have gone by. And this roster, they didn't do well last split. They made no changes, but they came in and it seems to have coalesced very well this split. And this is like a true like growing roster. And so they did really, really well together. But I think they still have space to grow. They just weren't quite good enough to beat the other teams, unfortunately. And then we had Red, who was, if you want to know what Brazilian League of Legends is like, watch Red. Watch Titan. That man is like insanity. The CBLOL insanity condensed into one person. Titan will scream like crazy mid-game. He's so hyped. He will carry games. He will literally 1v5 games. Red in the regular season had 2 open nexuses. They came back from 2 open nexus games, which like 40, 50-minute games. And I think they had another 2 where they had 1 nexus turret standing by the end of it. Like this team's insane. Their mechanical prowess is insane, but they could not come together. And I actually want to talk about their coaches as well, because they had Coach Kalek, who is known to be a very structured guy. Like he likes his game plan very clear. He's very strict with how he wants to play. And they had Coach Nelson as well, who's an import, who's played in EU, coach teams like XL, G2, and the coaches, like, man, with coaches like that, you expect good macro. Red was just all over the place. I don't know what happened.
I think it was maybe, I wouldn't say inability, but maybe the inability of the players to adapt to Nelson's style, because I know Nelson has a very from the stuff that he's done on like live and in interviews and stuff like that, he has a very strict way of viewing the game in regards to like, this is how you should do it. We should play for this kind of map control, or these are the champions that are strong. Like he's always been very open about his ideas, at least publicly. So do you think it was like maybe not a failure on Nelson necessarily, but maybe a failure of the players to kind of grasp his playbook? I mean, the best example would be like in soccer or football or in American football, a lot of coaches have trouble getting their players to understand complex playbooks or understand new regimes. Do you think that was maybe one of the issues?
100%. Like having seen what Nelson and Kalek have achieved in the past, I have no doubt that the knowledge is there. Like their understanding of the game is really, really solid. But as a coach, there's knowing the knowledge and then there's trying to implement it, right? And I don't want to say like it's on the players. It can be very hard to interface, with a team, especially as star-studded a roster as what Red Canids have, right? Like you've got some of the best players individually in their roles, and they know it, right? So it can be hard sometimes to like figure out, okay, how do we want to do this? And the other problem too is like Titan traditionally has been a very unbridled player. Like he will make miracles for you happen. He will take a situation they have no right winning and they'll win it. But that same unbridled nature also causes them to lose games where they should have won. Like you can follow the game plan all the way to the last step and stumble at the last spot. That happened to Red a couple of times this split. So I do think like it's something there between the coaches and the players. Like somehow it just didn't quite connect. And I don't know if that's going to change, because I feel like if Red gets to the point where they can implement Nelson and Kalek's game plans perfectly, we kind of lose that spark that makes some of these players like Titan, FNB who they are. To an extent, but hey, we'll see how that goes. And then that leaves us with Pain and Loud. Pain, I think, has 5 straight grand finals now, 4 straight. Wait, how many second place finishes in a row? Like,
I think it's 5. I think it's 5 in a row. Correct. I think they've made grand finals 5 splits in a row. If I could be wrong, I'm sorry, I haven't casted CBLOL or been as attentive as you.
For sure. And to be fair, like I should know this off the top of my head. Like I literally was on the desk for finals, but I have kind of like blocked out. I
get it. I completely understand. For anybody
who don't know, I'm a Pain fan.
Yeah.
So like I'm a huge Pain fan. So like watching them. Okay, so they've made grand finals 5 times since franchising. There's been 6 splits since franchising. So they've been in 5 out of 6. They've won 1, and then they've got 1-1. They went 1 third and then 4 second places. So they've done 4 consecutive grand finals, which they've lost. I think it happened again this split.
Yeah, I think what I'd ask you is, you're a fan of, you're a Pain fan, stuff like that. But are you just a huge fan of Pain as well? Like what is that, right? Because this team is I think one of the most mind-boggling teams in CBLOL, because the talent is there. The mechanics are there. Like they understand. I would say they understand map movement as a top 2 team. For whatever, like at what point can you just call them chokers? Like is it just in their DNA to choke during the grand finals? Like what would you say as a dedicated Pain fan and analyst? We're gonna get into it. What do you think just causes this team to just falter at the end?
Good branding. I mean, if we're going to be a sucker for Pain, you call yourself Pain, you got to deliver it somehow. No, actually, they do definitely have a mental block against Loud specifically. So the first of those 4 grand finals was against Red Canids, which they lost. But that was more on Titan just being the monster that we know him to be, and he pulled out a miracle. You put Pain against that Pain roster against that Red roster 10 times for me. Like I don't think Red wins that. Like more than half the time, even. Like I think that was just the one shot that Red gets. But against Loud, you give me Loud versus Pain, and I say Loud wins that 9 out of 10 times because there's just a mental block. Like Pain statistically was the best team. Their macro actually looked better than Loud in the regular season, and even throughout most of the playoffs. Well, okay, half the playoffs. But somehow when it comes to Loud, it just doesn't seem to matter. Pain's macro actually like visibly takes a dip in their decision making. So I think there is a mental aspect that is definitely an issue there against Loud. But props to Loud, man. We can start talking about them a little bit. I said in the regular season they don't care about that. That's why there's a thing in Brazil. People say "Coisa ruim voto." The monsters are back. In playoffs. Every time it happens, like they're just like, oh, that. Or Koisa room actually translates directly to like bad thing. The bad thing is here.
The bad they don't even have it's just an enigma. It's just like an aura of like, oh my god, like they're back. It's like it's not even monsters. They're too vile. They're too insane to even describe. I do want to dial back and talk about that Pain roster a little bit because like on paper, Wiser, a fantastic top laner, one of the Korean imports, in my opinion, that has very well been able to dominate CBLOL to some aspects. Very nice champion pool. Karaoke as a jungler. He's somebody that I've recognized as a very good jungler. I think the only individual that I don't really understand or maybe understand their value, and maybe you can kind of shine some light on, is that Pro Delta support matched up with B-Voy. Everybody knows who B-Voy is. Everybody's known what he's done on the Misfits side. And not to count it out, Dinkato as well, a legendary solid mid laner. But what does Pro Delta add to this roster?
Okay, so I will say this roster is probably the best Pain Gaming roster we've ever seen. Unfortunately, because they've not won, people probably remember the BRTT rosters better because those are the ones that have actually won. And by the way, Wiser is gonna become domestic, or he won't be considered import this year after Split 1. He gets the
green card, resident status,
partway through Split 1. So that's going to be nice. We might say Croc's the most Brazilianized, but Wiser's stuck around probably the longest. So this bot lane, Pro Delta, the previous support was Damage, right? And I want to give Damage his fair credit because yes, he did choke a little bit, but all of Pain choked against Loud. I thought Damage was really good. And so I had questions about Pro Delta coming in. Pro Delta literally last split didn't even play in Academy. He was put on the main Pain Gaming roster as a substitute and did not play a single game. So I was like, I don't know what Pain are doing with this guy. Then he comes in and stuns all of us. Right from the get-go, first couple of games, Pro Delta's mechanics were absolutely cracked. And he played like Yumi. So it's like, okay, kind of hard to see sometimes like how good exactly your mechanics are and your macro. Because you're not roaming or doing anything. You're playing like enchanters. You're just sitting with your AD carry or maybe your jungler. But as the split went on, Pro Delta showed that he was potentially one of the best supports in the league. So fresh young rookie who's been trained up properly. It's not the type of rookie where you just chuck him into the fire and hope that he proves himself. No. Pain actually brought him up right. So Pro Delta and B-Boy were honestly probably the best laning duo, at least statistically, throughout the regular season. Even in playoffs, they were actually beating Root and Seos statistically. And even in the final series, I would argue Pro Delta and B-Boy didn't lose their match. B-Boy got screwed because they called B-Boy out of lane to go contest Herald, and it was like, okay, we have 5v4 and we still lost Herald, and Root's just farming up a storm down bot, right? Like, that's not a fair matchup. So the idea was to give like B-Boy his own support that he could just mold from the get-go and create the best potential bot lane. And I'd argue that Pain succeeded in terms of doing that. For certain value succeed because they still lost a lot. But
I mean, regular season wise and kind of you can still individually judge players, right? I don't think it'd be the correct thing to say that Loud had the best player in every role. by any means, right? There was definitely, teams that had, like you said, Pain Gaming, Red potentially, right? These top 4 teams had players that you could argue, oh yeah, this guy's a top 1, top 2 in his role here. We've talked about Pain Gaming. Now we're coming to the monsters, the individuals that have won CBLOL. Can you kind of, like you said, take me through that? So regular season, they faltered a little bit in the beginning. What changed for Loud throughout? Like I've known through your prep document, I've had the honor of seeing and feasting my eyes upon it.
You drafted most of these guys, actually.
Yeah. Way back. It's a layup a year and a half ago. But I understand that this year specifically, there was a heavy focus on their macro, right? They were one of the best objective-based teams in the league. They were heavy on Herald control, heavy on Dragon control. They also weren't losing a lot of plates, right? When they were making the swaps to Herald, like they're very intelligent about how they approach the Herald fight and make sure they weren't giving too much away here. What was the reasoning? Was it their coaching staff? Was it someone like Belize, Shanquin, or what kind of happened during the playoffs for them to just turn up the dial to 12?
That's a complicated question, because part of it literally just comes down to the fact that they turned their monitors on, or they decided to actually start playing the game. Like we said, they started the split, I think, with a 3-game loss streak right from the get-go, like MSI hangover and everything. Then they start winning. I think they went on like 7-game win streak after that. But what that record doesn't show you is actually how shaky those first few wins were. Their first win came up against Liberty, who was arguably one of the 2 teams that struggled the most this split, or the team that struggled the most, period, this split. And they won, but it wasn't pretty. It was hell ugly. Their next game was against Kaboom, the other bottom team, and they struggled on that one too. Like, they were struggling against some of the worst teams in the league to start. And that's just reflective of how they like to play, because Robo wants to limit test during the regular season. So you kind of have to ignore all of that. But that makes their stats even more impressive, considering they dominated objective control with that bad of a start to the season where you can just scrap the first half of the regular season. That's why I said this split, it's not the parity we expected. Loud just crushed everybody, and it kind of wasn't even close, considering how everything kind of went there. Now, the names are familiar. Like we said before, this is the same team that went to MSI 2023. It's like 4/5 of the same roster that showed up at Worlds last year. And this split, because it's the same roster and they've won like 3 times in a row, they set a whole bunch of records. I mentioned that 3-peat is a record in CBLOL. But the top lane, Robo, Mr. Top Lane himself, has now tied BRTT as the winningest player of all CBLOL history. Like, he's got 6 championships under his belt. And fun fact, he won it in the same city, Recife, where he won his first championship on the same roster with BRTT.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah,
and
fun for him.
Robo as a top laner, I feel like this guy is just kind of unkillable, unfallible at some points, right? It feels almost like he's on another level, right? When it comes to playoffs. Is it what is this? Like, what is this man? Like, he's almost, I would say he's almost as popular as BRTT, right? In terms of his notoriety and how famous he is and all the memes and stuff like that. I think, he's popping off on Twitter as well right now. Like, he's just there doing some collaboration with Coach CL. Like,
yes,
this guy, who is this man?
The man, the myth, the monster. Who knows, man? Robo, I'll tell you the one thing. Robo is not infallible. He is very fallible. The thing isn't that he doesn't die. It's that even if you kill him, it doesn't make a difference.
It doesn't matter.
We were joking in the broadcast that the thing with Robo isn't that he gets that much better in playoffs, or not statistically. The thing is that somehow when he dies in playoffs, it matters more. Like, he is able to make his deaths worth more, but he'll still die in playoffs a lot. And in solo kills or solo deaths, sometimes that made absolutely no sense. But he coordinates a lot better with his team. In terms of his popularity, definitely Robo is getting up there. It's hard to match BRTT because BRTT was there from the start.
Yeah.
And BRTT better than double lift became such a huge thing in 2015 internationally as well. So it'll be hard for Robo, but he's definitely making a case. And I would actually argue that the biggest reason why Loud is the bad thing in playoffs is because Robo decides to actually play properly in playoffs compared to everything else. Like, yes, everybody else steps up, but Robo steps up the most. And that's why we get highlight moments like his 1v2 in the grand finals, like in the enemy base. He just doesn't care. Why we get his Olaf moments, and he gets Olaf banned against him almost permanently on the international stage. It's because this man is clutch. Now, that's domestically. internationally, Robo has struggled, and he's been our biggest problem as well. His Rise game, man, we still have PTSD as broadcasting from that, like last at MSI when he pulled it out. Like, just why he does crazy things. It works domestically, internationally against the best the world has to offer. Maybe not so much.
And would you classify him maybe? I wouldn't even necessarily count him as like a weak side top laner, right? He's just a top laner, in my opinion, that's been able to get value even though he's put down, right? And this is not just on, he's not just playing tanks and getting value as an engage. Like, he's playing like high risk, high reward kind of top laners, getting dove, right? Getting picked on, and he's still able to have an impact, whether it's in team fights, whether it's like a flash, jack stun, whether he's just split pushing with whole break. Like, he has all these different ways to derive value from his champion pool, and regardless of what playstyle is happening. So would you call him the most complete top laner in CBLOL, or is he more of a, he always gets value, he's always the time top laner that you can rely on?
It's really hard because of how inconsistent he is during the regular season to call him the most complete top laner. I'd argue Weiser's probably more complete than him, but I would probably call him the most clutch top laner, consistently clutch.
And then so out of Robo now we get into somebody I think you definitely have a soft spot for, just the way that you talk about Croc, the way you speak about Croc. I mean, is there something I'm missing here? Or do you definitely love this player? I've got to assume here.
I've come to love him, Shippy, but I will say you and Trajan definitely were his biggest proponents. I remember early on when he was on Renska, you and Trajan saw his potential long before I did. But yeah, I mean, Croc's an awesome dude as an individual, like not even as a player, just as a person. He's a really, really nice guy. And he just adapted to Brazil so incredibly well. I think that's what makes him so lovable, is his willingness to like embrace the Brazilian culture on the Rift and off the Rift. And he's somebody who really feels a lot too. I remember we got an interview with him, I think, in week 2, like while he was still in the middle of that 3-game slump to start the season. And the poor kid looked so depressed, man, when on that interview. Like, he just had nothing to say. He's like, we're just bad. Like, we're bad. We're like, oh, like, cheer up, Croc. Like, we just don't want to see you sad, man. Like, yeah, he's a great guy. And on the Rift as well, he's, this split specifically, he's been the biggest playoff monster, I think, for Loud. He won 5 out of the 6 last MVPs they won in Winners Finals and Grand Finals. Wow. Like, Croc was sweeping it. It wasn't even close. I think Winners Finals, he picked up all 3. So you can tell like how big an impact this guy has on the team. Him and Robo, though, are the two who are most likely to throw games, especially in the early game. I think the start of the split saw Robo and Croc like individually invading the enemy jungler, independently of each other, and both getting killed, like super random. And Croc, of course, was the guy who forgot to buy items against G2.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, again, MSI, hey, he won. It's fine. It's okay. Like, they didn't win, sorry, but he didn't die at level 1, so that's a win in my books when you forgot to buy your items. Yeah, Croc's a fun guy to watch. And I think for Worlds, he's probably the guy I'm keeping my eyes on the most for the early game. If Croc gets his invades off, if he gets his ganks off, Loud setup, and Loud will do well. If he doesn't get the ganks off and doesn't get the invades off, that doesn't mean it's over for Loud. It just means that the spotlight shifts away from him towards more of the carries on this roster. But if you want excitement from Loud, then it's probably going to come from Croc early game.
And from Croc, now we move on to the man that is hated across EU, right? Mr. Tinowns himself, right? I think when EU hears the name Tinowns, they a little bit of doubt comes into them when they got to face this man because of obviously what happened to Alliance. He was on that original Kaboom roster way back when, has now evolved into a player. This guy is champion Ocean incarnate, I would say, for CBLOL. Like, he can quite literally play anything. The amount of different styles that I've seen him play, he's played that supportive Roam, Galio, like Engage, Lissandra. I mean, he's done it all. Like, is there anything left for Tinowns to evolve his game? Like, what? Like, he just, at this point, he just has to go to a major region, right?
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if a major region wants to pick him up. Whether he would want to go is, of course, a different issue, because Tinowns, is somebody who cares a lot about family as well. And I don't know if he'd want to necessarily leave Brazil. I guess if the region's good enough, maybe. But yeah, I mean, Tinowns has been around CBLOL for such a long time. Like, Kaboom was 2014, right? And if you think about it, CBLOL was effectively like 2013, I think, was the first real split people consider. as CBLOL, and he beats Alliance there, right? And MSI 2021 against Mad, he had the Baron steal on a Zoe over the wall, that paddle star, and actually brought Pain Gaming at the time within spitting distance of actually winning that game. And if they had, maybe they make it out of play-ins. He's also been consistently probably the best player on the international stage. He's just rock steady. This guy doesn't miss. That said, he doesn't always pop off either. People call him the Brazilian faker. I mean, I think that's doing Tinowns a bit of a disservice sometimes, but he has that champion notion, right? He can play anything because he's been playing for so long in CBLOL that no matter what the meta is, he can whip something out. And this split specifically, Tinowns has had counterpick the most frequently on Loud, and it matters because he can single-handedly warp games. When LeBlanc was meta, there was always the risk of a Lissandra pick from him shutting things down. When people were picking dive comps with Kai'Sa, not the AP Kai'Sa, like the AD Kai'Sa, and they're just diving in, you got to watch out for Swain from Tinowns. That pick just messes up the game plan completely. If they need skilling, Tinowns can do that. In the grand finals specifically, Tinowns' blind picking ability wasn't shown as well. The risk of a LeBlanc was drawing bans left and right. Dinkedo pops up one game with Talia. Tinowns next game says, I'll blind it against you because I can do the exact same thing you did. I can do whatever you do, but better. So to me, Tinowns is the rock of this team. He is the absolute foundation. And as long as he's there, Loud will never really crap the bed. Like Robo and Croc can do crazy things, trusting that there's skill coming from the mid lane. There's backup coming from the mid lane.
And he kind of adapted his playstyle and his champion pool a little bit from regular season to playoffs. I see a Zerath being picked up here.
Yeah.
I see some, Ari, Talia. In the regular season, he has a game of Aurelion Sol. Like you said, the Swain he's got 2 games of. I mean, this guy's all over the place. Would you say he's proficient enough to pick these kinds of champions? Or obviously not every single game was a win, but it feels like he's just willing to take any matchup, very self-sacrificing. You said he got counterpicked, but also when you get that counterpick, when you're opting into playing these kinds of weird matchups, you're saying, hey guys, this game's on me today. Like this game is going to be on me. I'm taking the resources. I'm taking the counterpick. Like was his Swain effective when you saw Aurelion Sol, right? The Zerath, like was this stuff that you'd be like, man, this guy is actually picking it and dominating the competition with?
100%. Actually, fun stat about his Swain pick. He's never lost on it career-wide. Like he's 100% win rate on it. And he's picked it like 10 times at this point over his career. Yeah. So that pick is 100% counter pick. He does not blind it. He picks it when he knows it's going to screw you. And he certainly screws you very effectively. So yeah, and I use the term self-sacrificing, Shibi. I actually really agree with that term, very selfless, even when you're doing counterpick, because when he counterpicks, it's not for his lane. It's not like, oh, I'm going to dumpster you in lane and, take off. A lot of times it's what the team needs. And sometimes the counterpick isn't really a true counterpick. It's more like, okay, what does our comp need to round things out? What's the
It's a compositional counterpick sometimes, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes the laning isn't going to be the easiest for it. Like when he picks Cassiopeia, sometimes the lane matchup's not the best for him. But he knows that if he picks that Cassiopeia now, 20 minutes into the game, the other team's not going to be able to do anything. So he's willing to do that. And to me, like that's the hallmark of, one of the best players of all time. The biggest problem for Tinowns right now is just that he's not flashy enough, which is weird to say about a Brazilian player. But there are flashy players on this team. And so Tinowns often gets ignored by that. But I think for teams to ignore Tinowns would be the biggest mistake they could make against Loud.
And finally, we move on to, I want to talk about them kind of as a duo. Obviously, it's both Root and Seos. For people unfamiliar with Root, this guy, I remember he played on Generic Green Wings. He played on Sandbox Gaming. He actually was a full, bred kind of Korean player and then moved over to CBLOL at a certain point in his career. And obviously, Seos, this guy's just a monster. I undoubtedly think he's one of the best supports in CBLOL, if not the best support, simply because of the amount of flexibility he has in his champion pool when it was the Enchanter meta way back when. But also, this guy's engaged champions are primo, man. Like this dude is a madman, and he finds engage angles. He finds stuff that I'm like, how are you even thinking of that, right? So like to talk about this bot lane as a duo first, what were they doing so well to kind of gain advantages or just become this really huge, monster of a bot lane?
Well, rather than talk about what they were doing, Shibi, let's talk about what they weren't doing. They made no mistakes. This bot lane just doesn't screw up, which makes them incredibly hard to punish. They're not necessarily the strongest laning duos. I think in CBLOL, I'd say B-Boy Pro Delta were probably stronger.
Yeah.
Bruntsy Jojo was stronger in lane. Titan Frosty could be stronger, but they could also throw the game. So that was kind of 50-50.
High variance.
Yeah, but Root and Seos, they were the opposite. This was a rock city bot lane that just doesn't quit. Like, even if you beat Root in lane, that's very relative. Like, you come out with a CS differential. That's all you come out with. You don't see Root like dead 10 times in lane ever. And you know that come the mid to late game, Root will be there. He'll do exactly what you need him to do. And his team fighting spacing is rock solid. I want to highlight something as well for CBLOL. CBLOL, this is a region that doesn't need imports, strictly speaking. They actually have a very robust academy system, and they've got a lot of good domestic talent. And one of the roles that has traditionally been strongest in CBLOL is the AD carry role.
Yeah.
So Root came along. No import had ever won CBLOL in the AD carry position. It's always been a Brazilian AD carry. Root's the first and only non-Brazilian to win in CBLOL in the AD carry position. And he did it again this split. So he's just super rock solid. I think his KDA reflects that best. Like, he has some of the lowest deaths among all AD carries, regular season or playoffs. So yeah, Root's really solid. And Seos is just really solid alongside him. Seos is an interesting figure because now there's conversation about who's the best support all time in CBLOL. And Seos is up there right now. He's got the most titles, that's for sure. And this man, he broke a record in a way, not in a positive way though, unfortunately, this split. He has actually never lost a grand finals game till this split. He just lost his first grand finals game. He's been in 4 grand finals, man. And he's never lost a grand finals series still. So he's still got that record going for him. He's played under a whole bunch of different metas, kind of similar to Tinowns. His champion pool is very, very wide. You won't see it because right now supports like what? Rel, Alistar, Nautilus, and the Odd Leona pretty much. So it doesn't look very wide, but anytime the meta shifts, Seos is right there. He's been consistently one of the best performing supports. But again, he's not flashy. And I'd actually say that for Seos, he's not the best primary engager. He can fulfill that role, but I much more prefer it when he follows up on Croc or Robo, who's just like face planting into the enemy, and then he follows up to add CC to make sure that they can maximize that chaos. I think that's where he really, really shines. And I think that's a role that a lot of supports don't specialize in. Most supports are best going in first, but if they're not the first ones in, then they kind of get torn between, hey, do I peel back and protect my AD carry? Do I go in and follow up? And Seos just doesn't have that problem. He always picks the optimal follow-up move.
I think that point is going to be glossed over a little bit, what you mentioned really earlier. Seos is only dropped 1 game in all the grand finals that he's participated, which is 4. For people that are listening, that means he's, I believe, what, 12-1 in grand finals matches, guys. Not series, matches. This guy has played 13 games in the grand finals. Most of them have been 3-0s. He's only lost 1 game. And I get it, right? You know, it's one guy. It's just one guy. It's a team game. But to do that consistently over 4 splits, that you definitely have that impact. And so, yeah, I think that point is I don't want that to be glossed over. This guy is nearly undefeated, if not, you know, one of the best performing players in grand finals. There's not a choke gene in his body, right? I would argue he's even clutch in that regard, or even, you know, domination in that. So we've talked about the individual pieces of Loud. I do want to kind of understand how they all kind of fit together, this amalgamation of different players where you said this bot lane doesn't make mistakes, but then the top side is the one to throw. And then you've got this, you know, selfless mid laner playing all these different matchups, not just counterpicking for the lane, but counterpicking for the team. He's got a Swain, he's got a Xerath. How does this all kind of come together to form a team that is probably one of the most dominant teams you've had this split?
Well, it's magic, because I can't explain it with stats. It's really weird. Usually in modern League of Legends, we always have to talk about resource allocation, right? Because we've seen super teams form where everybody is carries and it just doesn't work because everybody wants gold, and that means nobody gets the actual gold they want to get. Loud somehow has found the perfect balance with their team. And it's not clear cut because they actually have carries in every single role. Heck, I'd even throw Seos as a support into that. Like, he can literally carry games. If you give him enough gold, like, he just becomes an unkillable engage machine for the team. So Loud, the thing that has impressed me most with them and their coaching staff is that they are very flexible. They're very versatile. Any style composition, they can pull it off. And so you can't really just say, okay, we'll just shut down Robo because he's the primary carrier, or we'll shut down Root because he's the primary carrier. No, no, no. They will just flex around who's the primary carry. And that's the most beautiful thing about this team. I think part of that is experience. I think when we first saw them 2 splits ago at Worlds 2022, there was a very clear delineation of how they wanted to play, which was Croc, go camp Robo and get him ahead, or go camp Bruncy, win the lane, and then we'll play from one of the side lanes. Tinowns will just play to those side lanes. Then at MSI, we saw the evolution of that, which is more team fight based, where it's like, okay, Robo will just do Robo things, get Tinowns, get Root ahead, and then we'll play from mid to late. This split, they've actually tried a whole bunch of different things throughout the regular season and playoffs. And the sickest thing, Shibby, is I don't think any team has actually pushed them this split. So I don't even know what Loud's comfort is. They just kind of stuck with, okay, we'll just play generically strong Kai'Sa comps, or we'll say generically strong like Xayah comps, and it worked. Can they play more? Undoubtedly. We've seen glimpses of Poke comp come through. We've seen glimpses of more top side oriented carries from Robo, but not consistently because no one's pushed them to it.
Okay, so we've now have set the stage. We've kind of unveiled why and how Loud have made it to this point. I do want to dive in now to maybe what we would consider Worlds expectations, because this Worlds obviously is a little bit different formatting wise, right? They have they do still have like a play-in stage, and then they have like a Swiss stage. I believe we have all the brackets, all the draws have been figured out round. We know what side of the bracket they're on. Looking at their potential matchups and looking at Loud, and like I said previously, I told this offline, you can be as much of a fan as you want about CBLOL and Loud, or you can be as realistic as you like possible. I think a little bit of both is the best balance, but I do want you to talk about Loud and kind of what you're expecting of them on the international stage, right? And maybe run through best case scenario, worst case scenario.
Sure. So I think for Brazil right now, the general sentiment in Brazil is that we're afraid to hope. We're afraid to believe, kind of thing. Because Brazil, they look great. And honestly, when you look at them on paper, when you look at their matchups against other minor regions, Brazil should be doing well. But they've never made it out of play-ins. So we're at the point now where most Brazilians are just like, okay, we're scared to hope. Like, and the better it looks for the Brazilian representatives, the more scared Brazilian fans actually are. So going to Worlds this split, honestly, this is looking like the best bracket we've had like ever. Because as you mentioned, format changes, right? China and Korea don't have a team. They don't have any stakes in the play-ins anymore. North America versus EU will be 4th seed. One of those makes it in. And the group for Loud is GAM, R7, and PSG. It's not the best draw. The best draw would probably have been getting like 2nd seeds from Vietnam and PCS instead of 1st seeds. But it's not the worst draw either. The problem is the way the format runs is if you're 2nd seed, you're probably going to run up against NAEU 4th seed, which is, I think by most people's standards, like kind of a death sentence for minor regions. I do think we can still put up fights. So I don't want to call it a death sentence, but it's definitely going to be tougher. So Loud has to win all their games, all their series in bracket A. That would be the best case scenario for them. Is it possible? Yeah, I actually think it's very, very doable. I think VCS in recent splits have been a little bit more miss than hit, and they're volatile. But if we're talking about volatile regions, VCS might be number 1. Brazil is probably number 2. So we're kind of used to that like hit or miss style.
Well, also VCS hasn't been able to participate in international competition as of late, right? They've been one of the teams that had to opt out of, certain international tournaments and stuff like that. So would you say that their international experience isn't as up to par as Loud now that you're facing them?
Not really, because I think GAM was still there at MSI, and their change was in the bot lane. Their bot lane got swapped out, but their top 3, like Kiaya, Levi, and Kati, were all there at MSI 2023 anyways. Yeah. So I maybe for Team Wales, because this is like their first time. As a organization, some of their players have been to international events before, but unfortunately they're on the other side of the bracket. So like I said, not the ideal bracket draw for Loud, but certainly not a terrible one. So I think we can beat GAM. R7 and PSG is interesting. I know that Croc has been very vocal in interviews saying that he wants to meet up against PSG again, because PSG is the team that knocked out Loud at MSI.
Yeah. And
they feel very strongly that they could have won that they screwed up. So they want to run up against PSG talent again. So I definitely think this side of the thing, I'm very optimistic for Loud. But of course, being somebody who follows CBLOL, I have that lingering fear, of course, that Brazil chokes a little bit on the international stage. And on top of that, I get worried when teams dominate their region, because then what happens? Like, we know you can beat weaker teams, but what happens when you play against a team who's as good or better than you? Like,
The big
do
fish,
you
small
have what it
pond.
takes?
Yeah,
Exactly. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. But overall, I think I'm very optimistic. I think Loud can definitely make it out of the play-ins and into Swiss. Now, once we get to Swiss, that's a whole different issue. And frankly, I haven't looked at what Swiss seeding is going to be like for the minor regions that get, or whoever wins the play-ins, because one step at a time.
Okay, so let's talk about that play-ins bracket. Where would you think that Loud has their biggest advantages? Is it through Croc? Is it through their unfallible bot lane, right? When you match up against, teams like GAM, teams like PSG, or potentially R7, if you're shadowboxing these guys, what would you say Loud has their biggest advantages against? Maybe you can go through each of the teams, GAM, PSG, R7. If we have to face these guys in a best of 3 and or best of 5, where would we be able to get the advantages?
Okay, so first up is again GAM, because that's the confirmed matchup, right?
That's the confirmed match, yes.
Yeah. I have actually been watching some of the games, and shout out to VCS English. I looked at their prep talk as well for GAM. And I think Loud has a favorable matchup in their solo lanes specifically. Kiaya and Kati have not been particularly impressive to me, their solo lanes. But Levi is really cracked for GAM. Like, Levi makes those two solo laners look decent. So
I'm expecting an exciting jungle matchup. Levi versus Croc sounds like a duel, It sounds like a shootout between these guys.
Part of me feels like Croc's just gonna not go crazy. I think that's a safer alternative, but then who knows, right? It is Loud in game 1. Who can tell? But I'm more excited for the top half of the map. Slater and Pallet are good, but I think Root and Seos are really good as well. So I'm not worried about the bot lane. I think that's going to be more of a farm off situation to hit the mid to late game. And even then, I think the tipping point is going to be Robo and Tinowns, specifically for that matchup. So I think top side is going to be a little more exciting. GAM is also more liable to throw. One good thing about Loud is they're a team that doesn't throw. We've got a lot of teams in Brazil. Again, very high variance region. If VCS number 1, CBLOL is probably number 2. But Loud is not one of them. Our top 2 teams, Loud and Pain, they are rock steady. So if they can get a lead coming out of the early game, I'm going to feel very, very comfortable with that matchup.
Okay, so that's the GAM shadow box. We've seen kind of what happens against PSG, but like you said, Loud, felt that they could very much win that series if they run it back. Mm-hmm. Where do you think maybe what went wrong in the previous PSG series, and kind of what they can kind of take away and say, you know what, we're facing you a second time. Here's what we did wrong, and here's how we're going to play this.
I think part of it is stylistic matchup against the PCS in general. PCS plays a really good mid to late game. Their team fighting is really, really strong.
It's immaculate.
And Wako especially has always been a monster as an AD carry. So I think where Loud struggled in PSG Town last time was their team fighting wasn't as clean, and they were running up against one of the best team fighting teams. They didn't pressure early enough to be able to pop off. Coming into this tournament, I still think Root and Series are great, but because of what happened at MSI, I'm a little bit scared to say, okay, let's go to mid, late, and team fight. I think for Loud, if they want to win, it's still got to be that top side of the map. But I am looking at jungle specifically this time, because I think Croc has to accelerate the pace of the game against Ozzy and Maple. Drinja has a really good jungler as well. So this group actually as a whole, because even Audi from R7 is a good jungler. Like, this group has a lot of good junglers. And so that's going to be exciting to watch. Whereas against GAM, I was looking at solo lanes. For PSG, I'm looking at Croc. And it's going to be a tougher match for sure, I think, because it's volatile for Croc. And if Croc loses that matchup, things could go very, very poorly. But I think it's a jungle focus specifically for this matchup. And you got to try and win early, man. Don't let Wako hit late game. If you hit late game, then all bets are off, man. I think it's PSG favorite at that point.
And finally, the matchup against movie star R7. I think a team that has made some waves here and there, a team that is good in their own right. Do you think this might be the easiest team for Loud, or might be surprisingly you don't want to doubt them? Like, what would be that matchup? What would that matchup look like if like you said, worst case scenario, or like second worst case scenario in this sense?
I think a lot of people are actually underestimating R7, because LA has historically not been a strong region whatsoever. But I like everybody should remember, R7 knocked out GAM at MSI. So they're not a weak region, or they're not a weak team. But I think R7 suffers from the same thing that Loud did the split, where R7 is too dominant in the LOA.
Too good.
Like, it's not even close. Exactly. So I don't know how good R7 really is. From what we saw at MSI, they're pretty decent. That said, like, okay, maybe it's the CBLOL bias here. I feel like Loud's just better in every lane. Like,
it's okay to be
so
biased. It's okay. We'll bring the clips up. I'll be sure to bring the clip up on Twitter. This is CBLOL English. This is your guy. This is what he said. LLA. I mean, come at him if they win or lose. It's always fun to have that bias and banter, like you said. But I like the idea that I like how you highlighted that R7 is that they're that team, right? They're the team that eliminated GAM. They've got some pieces here, and I want you to finish your point on them.
You know, people say that there's a LA CBLOL rivalry. There really isn't. Like, yeah, there's rivals things, but if anything, Brazil actually used to compete more with Turkey than they did with LA back when Turkey was around. So there wasn't beef. Let me start it now. I'm going to say Laos is better across every single lane, from what I've seen. I just think, like,
there's the clip.
Yeah. Clip it and ship it. Laos is better across the board. That's it. R7, like I said, hasn't fully been tested. So maybe the players are better than what I'm giving them credit for. It's just that LA hasn't forced them to do it. But I'm going to say CBLOL is the same, right? I don't think that Loud was pushed terribly hard either. So I think there's leeway still for Loud. So if we get R7, I'm here for it. I'm down for it, right? Like, I'd be happy. And that would also mean that R7 beats PSG, which is
wild, right? Yeah, that's a crazy scenario, right?
Wait, sorry. There's a scenario where Loud loses to GAM and R7 beats PSG. I forgot about that because that's not going to happen. Loud's going to beat GAM.
Oh man, RMC is just starting beef with every minor region out. VCS, did you hear this guy? anyways.
Better support my boys, man. No, like I said, I do think this is CBLOL's best shot that we've had in recent years. So I generally do think that. I'm excited for this group. I think this group is very close. Like, there's a lot of good matchups, and I'm not really expecting any team to just stomp their way through. I know that PSG Town is the favorite coming up, but I do think they might trip up or I do expect to see some trip ups happen in some of these matches.
So we've talked about the potential advantages for Loud going against these teams. We don't have to go in depth in this regard for what the teams can do to them, but Loud holistically as a team, where do you see them struggling the most, right? If you want to, unveil some trade secrets, your analysis. Hey, I go to RMC, I say, hey, how do I beat Loud in a best of 3? What do I draft? Where do I look to get my advantages? Who do I look to pick on? What do I do? Do I play for the early game? Do I play for the mid game? Do I draft late and out team fight them? What is the blueprint, let's say, on how to beat Loud if I'm, X minor region team, or in this case, GAM, who might need it?
Just be better. No. That's traditionally where Brazil has struggled, right? It's against the major region teams, because pound for pound, they tend to be better across the rows. Now, specifically, if you're a minor region and say a comparable for GAM, PSG, R7, if you're trying to pick apart Loud, I think actually where you go is Croc. If you can shut down Croc, you stifle a lot of Loud's early game. So it helps a lot. Now, there will still be scaling, like Root and Seos and Tinowns, they're all monsters. Robo, depending on whether his monitor's on or off, whether it's Rob stay or not, could also be a huge threat. But I do think it's more about that bot side. And I'm looking at all these regions. All the bot lanes are actually pretty scary. Slater Pallet is cracked. Wacko and Woody are also really, really good. Seo and Seos, that's going to be confusing. Good luck, casters. And Lions, they look okay. So I feel like for R7, you just need to crack Croc as fast as you can and try and break topside as fast as you can, because Robo can be hit or miss. So the topside's a variable point of Loud. I think you break that as fast as you can, because you're not going to break Tinowns, you're not going to break Root, you're not going to break Seos.
And so getting that advantageous jungle matchup, getting something where you can potentially do like a late invade, or putting, Croc on something like a less, I would say, 1v1 style jungle, putting on something like the Sejuani, or maybe if Ivern is still in the meta, or even Maokai, right? And getting yourself something like the Jarvan, maybe a Rex. I mean, the meta coming into this Worlds is very, very, I wouldn't say very, very different. It is very, very different for some teams, but for a lot of teams, they're entering into a new jungle meta, right? Where things like Jarvan are going to be very strong, right? I believe we have as
of recording, we don't even know what the Worlds patch is, like what the actual change.
Yeah, technically we don't. Yeah, I think the assumption is like, is it 13.18 or 13.19? I think that's the assumption, I believe. But I could be wrong on that. But yeah, as of recording, we don't know what the meta is. But based off of what we've been seeing in popular and solo queue as of right now, today, September 18th, I believe, we've been seeing a lot of Jarvan. We've been seeing a lot of these junglers that can abuse the Spear of Sojin kind of Spirit, Visage, Frozen Heart interact, Gore Drinker, all this weird stuff that's happening out there. That's kind of the interactions, the AD heavy junglers. I don't think, actually, I do think Naviri will be enabled, correct? But Briar won't be. Briar won't be. So yeah, as of recording, Naviri is enabled, Briar is not. Based on, I guess the final thing is the proposed patch, or based on how the patches are going, do you think the meta favors Loud? It favors some of these players, or do you think because they have people like Tinowns, they have people like Sayos, the meta doesn't really affect them and their play style?
I'll say this. I think the wilder the meta is, the bigger the difference, the better it is for Loud. Because we said before, Tinowns has been around forever. Robo has been around the block a couple of times. Sayos has been around for a long time as well. And even when it was sort of that Lucian Nami meta, when it was lane dominant AD carries, Root could still perform in that. So I'm very confident in Loud's ability to play pretty much any meta that you want to throw in. I think PSG Town's another team that has been around the block for a lot and can adapt very well. I don't know about GAM and R7 as much, but I will say VCS has traditionally either played off meta or very specific strategies. So I think big meta changes might actually screw GAM over a little bit. Like they'll have to cook a fast dish. You know, they won't have the ability to pull from their old playbook. No slow cookers there. So I think the wilder the change, the better it is for Loud, and specifically for jungle. If we get aggressive junglers back, Croc is going to be so happy. Croc has been playing supportive junglers like Sejuani, Maokai, not so much the Ivern, but not by choice. He's doing that because it's meta. This guy made his fame on Lee Sin, on J4, like champions that are aggressive like that. Like when Nocturne started sneaking its way back in with Nico, Croc was over the moon, man. So if we get that style of like aggressive junglers back, Loud's actually set up better than they are in the current meta.
Yeah. Final thing here before we kind of close off Loud. I love to do this. I love to talk to individuals and give their takes. What do you think is the 90-50-10 for Loud? So if you're unfamiliar, it's the 90% is the most likely outcome, 50% is the potential outcome, and obviously 10% is the least likely outcome, right? And you can go as wild as you want. Loud wins Worlds at the 10%, although that might be 0.1% in my opinion. You can go as crazy as you want. But what is your 90-50-10 for Loud?
Ooh, okay. 90 is, I think Loud will, or Robo will screw one of his games over. The 50 is they get out of play-ins and into Swiss. And
okay, that's actually very hopeful actually, and I think we've broken down why you are.
Wait, so you think Loud getting out on 50-50 is hopeful?
PSG is a pretty, I mean, like you said, PSG is there, man. Like the NA 4th seed or EU 4th. Like there's, I mean, look. Your CBLOL English caster, I'm not going to hold it against you if the 50-50 is a bit hopeful. That would have been like my 25% guess, really, realistically.
Okay.
I love CBLOL. I love CBLOL. You know, I have much love for them. I have much love for them.
Should be as a friend, you know, nothing to do with this, unrelated. How's your insurance policy looking like?
Well, you know, I've been moving around RMC, so I don't think you can find me. So 50% that they get out of plans. I think based off everything that you've said and kind of how you've broken down and everything, I don't think that's actually that crazy. So what is the 10%? What is the least likely, well, the least possible, but something that might happen?
10%.
They beat a Korean team?
Do I want to go? You know what? 10% we get bot gap from Root.
Oh, you just get a bot, like Root just absolutely smurf turbo stomps somebody.
The entire stage, yeah. I don't want to go like into Swiss stages yet because like I said, I actually haven't seen, I didn't look into like where you'd end up getting seeded depending on how you perform.
Yeah.
So I'm going to keep all my 90-50-10s into play-ins only for now.
Into play-ins only. Okay. Well, there you have it, folks. I hope this was a good primer, a good kind of little bit of a history lesson, but also just a way to get you guys excited for Worlds and to get you excited about some of these teams that you may or may not have brushed up upon, right? I know everybody doesn't have all day, every day to watch LPL, LJL, NA, EU, all these other CBLOL, VCS. So I'll try to do my duty to get the best people, the analysts, the color casters, everything like that from all these regions to give you a bit of a primer and to get you excited about some of this. So you can go in, talk to your friends and be like, oh yeah, I watched Shibby's region rundown video. Croc is a monster. This guy, you can look cool in front of your friends. You can look like a bona fide analyst and not just the Reddit armchair analyst yourself. But RMC, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for coming on. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, just popping in here to remind you that if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, as that always helps out. Don't forget to leave a comment down below sharing your thoughts. I try and respond to as many as possible. And last but not least, please hit that subscribe button and click on the notification bell so you guys know when my latest video is going to get uploaded ASAP. Once again, I appreciate every single one of you and hope you guys have a great rest of your day or night, and look forward to seeing you back here very, very soon.